Okay, so this morning I talked about the theories that came out of phase 1 of the research. What I'm going to be talking about now is what happened when we tested the theory about having an experienced first assistant, the importance of having an experienced first assistant. But more generally, tying in with that, thinking about how robot-assisted surgery changes the division of labour within the operating theatre. So I'm going to be presenting our findings from testing that theory of the experienced first assistant. So looking first of all at how the role of the first assistant differs between laparoscopic and robot-assisted operations, and the role that experience plays, but also the importance of an experienced scrub practitioner. I'll then summarise and then we'll have some questions. So this is the theory that we had at the end of phase 1 about the experienced first assistant. So the idea is that if you use an experienced assistant, their knowledge and experience will enable them to anticipate the surgeon's requests and react to events without prompting. This supports coordination between the surgeon and the assistant and ensures that the assistant's actions are performed in a timely manner. So this is one of the theories that we chose to test within phase 2. So what happened when we observed the operations? So it quite quickly became clear that there were significant differences in the tasks that a first assistant does in robotic compared to laparoscopic operations. So in a laparoscopic operation, the assistant's holding the camera and a grasper for retraction. There's typically no changes of instruments, and requests from the surgeon relate to movement of the camera and the grasper. But what you do see is there's a lot of variation in the extent of the assistant's involvement depending on their level of experience. So with more experienced surgical trainees, well, if you've got a surgical trainee as the first assistant, then the operation is going to take on a teaching element. And with more experienced surgical trainees, the surgeon and assistant will frequently swap roles. So the assistant assisting for more difficult parts of the operation, and then for other parts, the assistant would operate guided and assisted by the surgeon. In the robot-assisted operations, obviously the surgeon is now moving the camera and the surgeon can do some of the retraction. We observed assistants doing a range of tasks, so assisting with retraction, providing suction, inserting, removing swabs, applying clips to a vessel, changing the robotic instruments, temporarily removing the robotic camera in order to clean it. So maybe it seems like the assistant's actually doing more in the robotic operations just based on the list of tasks. But actually what they did with these tasks, which of those tasks they did varied according to their level of experience. But the key thing is that they can't swap roles in the way that they can in a laparoscopic operation. So there's limited opportunity for them really to be involved in that operation in the way that they would in a laparoscopic operation. And we were doing this, as I've said, we were doing this study alongside ROLAR. And in ROLAR, if the patient was randomized to a robotic operation, the surgeon could either do that operation totally robotic, or they could do a hybrid operation, so doing the first part laparoscopically and the second part robotically. And talking to some of the surgeons about their reasons for doing hybrid operations, one was that actually if you do a hybrid operation, then in the first part that you're doing laparoscopically, it gives the assistant more opportunity to be involved within the operation. Okay, so thinking about these unprompted assistants that we expected to see if you had an experienced first assistant. In laparoscopic surgery, there was the difference in the ability of an inexperienced and experienced assistant to work without prompting was very clear. So, for example, if you had an experienced assistant, they'll move the camera without being asked, they'll move the grasper without being asked, whereas an inexperienced assistant would typically require some guidance in relation to those tasks. What we found in the robot-assisted operations was that although the actions were largely performed correctly and in a timely manner, there was very little unprompted action. Although there was differences in the amount of instruction. What we found instead was that rather than acting unprompted, the assistants would offer assistance. And while I said there were a range of tasks that the assistants did, there were only 2 tasks that we saw the assistants doing across all operations, all robotic operations, and that was providing suction and assisting with retraction. So it seems that, kind of refining our theory somewhat, it seems that the experience that the assistant has provides them with knowledge about what actions are likely to be required, and they make use of that by making an oral offer of assistance rather than just acting without prompting. Although having said that, making these offers of assistance didn't require that much experience, that the assistants that we saw doing this differed substantially in their experience of the operation being performed. So why might they be doing this? Why might they be offering assistance rather than doing it unprompted? One thing is that it avoids the situation of providing assistance unprompted and having that assistance rejected. So we've got a couple of examples here. So as the surgeon cuts, a pool of blood becomes visible on the screen. The surgeon says, "Oh, lovely." The trainee says, "Suction, sucker gut coming in." The surgeon says, "I should be able to get it with this," I think, referring to the tonsil swab he has. And then another example, the trainee goes to assist with retraction, but the surgeon says, "I've got that, don't worry." And this rejecting offers of assistance was something that we didn't see at all in the laparoscopic operations. I think because in the laparoscopic operations, you have the consistency in the nature of the task that the assistants are undertaking. When it comes to retraction, it seems to be for the assistants less, because the surgeon can do some of the retraction, it seems that it's less clear what's needed when the surgeon's going to need assistance with retraction. So again, that's another motivation for offering assistance rather than providing that assistance unprompted. So the surgeons talked about the assistants still being, when we talked to them about this, the surgeons talked about the assistants still being on the learning curve, and so they're still learning what assistance to provide. But it seemed actually that the surgeons were also still learning what they could manage on their own and where they needed assistance. So again, a couple of examples. The trainee says, "Shall I retract up for you, Prof?" The surgeon says, "Yeah, maybe. Let me just see. I might be able to do something myself. It's the beauty of having 2 left hands, yeah?" actually, I think it would be helpful if you could just lift this bowel up here. And then similarly, the trainee says, do you want me to hold that out the way? The surgeon says, should be okay, sounding uncertain. So this isn't just about experience, though. So the surgeons, we saw this happening with surgeons who were very experienced in robotic surgery. But it suggests that it's only if and when surgeons establish more routinized ways of working with the robot in terms of what they undertake alone and where they require help, that the assistant could be expected to have awareness of what the surgeon requires and therefore provide that assistance unprompted. When we did the interviews with the urologists and the urology teams, that was quite interesting. And their comments in a way sort of supported this, because they felt that, certainly at one case site, they felt that the surgeons there for urology had developed very routinized ways of working, and therefore the assistants were able to anticipate what assistance was required and provide it without prompting. But something else they pointed to was actually the role of patient factors. So in colorectal, you have variation in the patient anatomy, which significantly impacts the extent of the amount of retraction that's going to be needed. Whereas talking to people in the urology teams, they felt that the amount of retraction that would be needed in a prostatectomy would be fairly similar across patients. So something else that came up when we were looking at inexperienced first assistants was actually the importance of having an experienced scrub practitioner and the role that they can play in guiding and assisting that first assistant who doesn't have experience of robotic surgery. And when you had this experienced scrub practitioner guiding and assisting the first assistant, things happened correctly and safely. So they weren't necessarily in a timely manner, because it took time for the scrub practitioner to explain to the assistant and provide that guidance, but it did ensure that things were done correctly and safely. Something else that we saw the scrub practitioners doing was changing the robotic instruments. And when we talked to the scrub practitioners about this, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not they should be doing this. They perceived, for lots of them, they perceived that inserting an instrument inside of a patient, if they haven't done the first assistant training, is outside the scope of their role. But, sometimes the surgeon would specifically ask the scrub practitioner to change the instrument rather than asking the assistant, and so they would do it. And similarly, if you know how to change a robotic instrument and you're working with an assistant who doesn't, again, there's quite a strong motivation there to just go ahead and do that. The support of the experienced scrub practitioner, where you had an inexperienced assistant who wasn't just inexperienced in robotic surgery, but was also inexperienced in the procedure, where you had that, the guidance went beyond things that were specific to robotic surgery. So the surgeon's not there at the patient's side in order to provide that guidance, so the scrub practitioner does it, and sometimes the surgeon would specifically ask the scrub practitioner to provide that guidance. So we've got an example here from our field notes. The camera's dirty. The surgeon asks the first assistant to take it out. He guides her and tells the scrub practitioner to help her. The surgeon moves his head out of the console. They clean the camera, the scrub practitioner and the first assistant, and put it back in. The scrub practitioner explains to the first assistant about how the suction works. The surgeon asks the scrub practitioner to explain to the first assistant how the hemalock works. She does. The surgeon asks for a hemalock for the first assistant to practice. The scrub practitioner gets a hemalock, and she and the circulating practitioner guide the first assistant on how to close it. So when we talked to teams about this, one thing that they talked about, or what some teams talked about, was how important the role of the scrub practitioner is within robotic surgery. So in terms of this role of guiding the assistant, because the surgeon isn't there at the patient's side to do that. And in some conversations at some sites, they felt actually that was really important. But because of that, it kind of flattened the hierarchy within the surgical team, that the scrub practitioner's taking on quite a different role. So the ability of the scrub practitioner to guide and assist the assistant depends, we found, on the assistant's willingness to acknowledge their need for support and to accept the scrub practitioner's support. So just a quote here. So this is from our field notes, where it was an fairly experienced assistant, but it was only his fourth robotic operation, and he said to the scrub practitioner, "You've done lots of these cases, haven't you? This is only my fourth. I need to hang out with you. I think I'd learn a few things." And there was another example where the assistant, again, they hadn't done a robotic operation before, so while the surgeon was docking the robot, she got the scrub practitioner to tell her what she would be doing and to explain the robotic instruments to her. So this willingness to acknowledge the need and to accept support obviously varies between individuals, but it did seem that the surgeon could influence this by asking the scrub practitioner to support the first assistants in this way, highlighting this aspect of the scrub practitioner's role. So, in summary, as well as providing increased precision potentially to the surgeon, robotic surgery allows the surgeon to do more, and this leads to a changed division of labour within the operating theatre. So for the assistant, they have a limited role and less flexibility in that role, and it's unclear what assistance they need to provide to the surgeon. For the scrub practitioner, their role is decreased in some ways, so fewer changes of instruments, but it's increased in other ways, so inserting instruments and guiding inexperienced assistants. But also there's these issues about role boundaries being unclear, should they be inserting instruments or not. So what we see is that the skills required and the potential to develop skills, areas of responsibility, and potentially status are all impacted by these changes in division of labour. So it's not just about changing communication, but it seems that robotic surgery leads to more fundamental changes in the nature of teamwork in the operating theatre. This has implications for skill mix and training. So we shouldn't just be focusing on the experience of the surgeon, but thinking of the skill mix of the whole team. When we, across all sites, the skill mix of the whole team was considered, but there was variation in the extent to which this was enforced. So, for example, in the clip that we looked at before, it was up to the circulating practitioner and the scrub practitioner to decide between them who would take on one of those particular roles. So issues about skill mix, issues about training. We've talked already about the need for training of the whole team. I was also going to say it raises the question of whether we should develop more formal roles for theatre nurses and ODPs as dedicated robotic assistants. But it's been quite interesting having conversations here today that it seems like a number of organisations are already doing that, having these specific dedicated roles. But I guess there's questions at a higher level, you know, at a NHS level, whether we should be thinking about this as a specific role. So I'll finish there and take any questions.
Take questions and comments. I'll be very surprised if there isn't any. Oh, sorry. Any questions?
I think it just reinforces the previous discussion. The physical distance of the operating surgeon from the patient who is busy, you know, at a distance. I think it does create a very different type of problem that, of course, in our conventional laparoscopic surgery or open surgery, we never came across, because you know, you could stop your assistant's hand moving in the wrong direction physically. But now the operating surgeon, the lead surgeon, is physically away. So I think, again, reflecting on what we saw earlier in that particular 7-minute video, if you did have a scrub practitioner or an experienced scrub nurse who had worked within that team, I think some of the things were avoidable. So it sort of reinforces the fact that you need, when we say a team structure, you're really talking about skill mix here. And if you have, you know, sort of personnel present within that team who are experienced enough, they can at times compensate for some of the shortfalls, be the shortfalls in relation to, for example, your registrar or assistant, or perhaps vice versa. But it just reinforces the role of the scrub practitioner here.
Yeah, and I think there's a question there when I say about having dedicated robotic roles, whether that should be, you know, a theatre nurse or ODP who does the first assistant training and then acts as a dedicated robotic first assistant, or if it's a dedicated robotic scrub practitioner. But probably, I think, thinking about what you're saying, you can't always, in terms of issues of training, we still need to train the surgical trainees. So actually maybe it's about having both roles so that, yeah, when it is a surgical trainee who will have less experience of robotic surgery, making sure that they're supported by that dedicated robotic scrub practitioner. Yeah.
Any more questions? Comments? Thank you, Rebecca. Okay. I think that fits very nicely into what Aaron's going to talk about anyway. It dovetails into it about simulation and training and education. So we'll just welcome Aaron to the stage. Thanks.